Thank you. And we now come to economic statement. Minister Bim Afellamy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With permission, I'd like to make a statement on the economy following the release of inflation data by the Office of National Statistics this morning and the conclusion of the IMF's annual Article 4 mission to the UK on Tuesday. The ONS data released today shows that CPI inflation has fallen to 2.3%, a return to normal levels last seen before the pandemic and Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. Earlier this week, the IMF said that the UK economy is approaching a soft landing, and it upgraded its forecast for UK growth in 2024, having seen lower inflation accompanied by stronger than expected growth in the first quarter. These developments are proof, Madam Deputy Speaker, the government's plan is working, that the difficult decisions we have taken are paying off, and the UK economy really is beginning to turn the corner. Now, let me start with the inflation figures. When the Prime Minister came into office less than 2 years ago, inflation was over 11%. The fall to 2.3% means that we have seen the fastest fall in inflation in nearly half a century. And the UK now has a lower inflation rate than the United States, France, and Germany. Food inflation is at its lowest level since November 2021, having fallen for 13 consecutive months, and food and staples like milk, cheese and eggs are now cheaper, actually, than they were this time last year, though there is more to do. Energy bills have also come down, with the price cap for the typical annual bill now over 25% lower than a year ago, though still above where they were in 2021. This fall in inflation has not happened by accident, Madam Deputy Speaker. The government has had to make difficult decisions to get us to this point, as well as supporting the Bank of England as it has acted to bring down inflation sustainably. We have reduced borrowing, now forecast to fall in every year to 2028-29, and we are acting to boost growth without generating inflation. We've frozen fuel and alcohol duty, which the OBR estimates will reduce inflation by 0.2% in this financial year. Moreover, in the face of widespread pressure, we've reached fair pay deals for public sector workers instead of doing what the party opposite would have done and cave in to inflation-busting pay demands. We must always remain vigilant when it comes to inflation, but today's numbers show the benefits of sticking to our plan. We know that recent years have not been easy for people. But with wages having now grown faster than inflation for 10 months in a row, families around the country will start to see their money go further. And we're doing more. Because this side of the House, we recognise that while the tax rises of recent years may have been necessary at that time of crisis, they should not be permanent. We will do the hard work to bring taxes back down, because we know that to do so will lead to more growth for our economy. My right honourable friend, the Chancellor, has already delivered tax cuts worth £900 for the average worker. Since 2010, the effective tax paid by somebody on an average salary has fallen under Conservative governments from 24% to 19%. And combined with national living wage increases, that means the after-tax income of somebody on the lowest legally payable wage has gone up by 35% in the same period. Labour's approach is different, Madam Deputy Speaker. Every single Labour government since the 1970s has increased the tax burden in both good times and in bad. And given the fiscal rules that they have set, the only way for the party opposite to pay for their spending commitments would be to raise taxes by considerably more than the £20 billion of tax increases that they have already outlined. I will now turn to the IMF's annual Article 4 mission to the UK and what it said about the government's other economic priority, beyond inflation, to deliver growth and opportunity for the whole of this United Kingdom. The IMF's message was overall a positive one. We have seen growth of 0.6% in the first quarter of this year, stronger and more broad-based than many expected, many independent forecasters. with no G7 country growing faster in the first quarter on a quarter-by-quarter basis. And the IMF have now upgraded their forecast for the whole of this year from 0.5% to 0.7%. And in April, they said that the UK is expected to see the fastest cumulative growth of any major European economy over the next 6 years. This is partly of a result of our focus on areas that the IMF says are critical to delivering sustainable economic growth, boosting jobs, boosting the labour supply, and increasing business investment. We've already got a proud record on jobs. The president of the CBI recently described the UK as a job-creating factory. That's because over the last 14 years, we've built one of the most flexible, dynamic labour markets in Europe. But we cannot take this for granted, Madam Deputy Speaker. And we cannot let the party opposite impose new burdens on employers, which would turn a job-creating factory into a French-style, inflexible labour market. Unemployment in France, as it so happens, Madam Deputy Speaker, is nearly double that of the United Kingdom. Indeed, not far off where it was in the UK under the last Labour government. We must not turn the clock back. The OBR estimate that cuts in national insurance will bring the equivalent of 200,000 more people into the workforce, enough to fill nearly a quarter of the vacancies in our economy. And we are reforming welfare. Labour has said they're against welfare sanctions. That's fair enough, that's their position. That will mean more people on our welfare rolls, not less. But my right honourable friend, the member for Central Devon's reforms, will help 1 million people move from welfare into work at a cost of £2.5 billion. Meanwhile, the introduction of full expensing, the biggest business tax cut in decades, will boost business investment by £15 billion in the coming years and give this country the most generous capital allowances in the OECD. There is more to do, and the IMF are right to point out that further bold reforms will be needed and that boosting growth and productivity is the key challenge for the United Kingdom. But to conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, in the words of the IMF's Managing Director, the UK is in a good place. Inflation is back to more normal levels. Growth is picking up. Wages are rising. We're cutting taxes. The plan is working, and the difficult decisions this side of the House have taken are starting to come off. Now is not the time to change course, because when it comes to Labour's policies on jobs, welfare reform and tax, we know the difference, if they're elected, will be profound and damaging for every family in this country.
Shadow Minister Tulip Sidhu.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Minister for advance sight of his statement. And of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, that it is welcome that the rate of inflation is finally slowing after 3 years of the government missing every single target. But to be frank, Madam Deputy Speaker, the tone-deaf victory lap we are seeing from the government today will feel like a slap in the face to the British people who, after 14 years of Conservative chaos, are still significantly worse off. While Conservative ministers are popping champagne corks about the rate of food prices rises, the typical family shop has gone up by nearly £1,000 since 2019. Those families will not be celebrating. And while the Chancellor and Prime Minister gaslight ordinary British families that the cost of living crisis is over, household costs are up more than £150 a week compared to before the last election for a two-earner household. The Minister claims that the economy has turned a corner. In reality, the Conservative record on growth has been nothing short of pitiful. If the UK economy had grown at the average rate of the OECD in the last 14 years, it would now be £140 billion larger. And it isn't just about lines on a graph. This would have meant an additional £50 billion in tax revenues to invest in our public services and more money in working people's pockets. I also noticed with great interest that in his speech the Minister is selectively quoting from the IMF's report. The same report that he's triumphantly citing, the IMF confirmed that under the Conservatives, the UK is suffering from the lowest growth in the G7. And just this week, the IMF said that the longer-term growth prospects of the UK remain subdued. This is the Conservative Party's legacy: a poorer Britain, working people worse off, and the public realm in disarray. And I also think the Minister is slightly confused about his government's record on tax. On the Conservatives' watch, the tax burden is the highest in 70 years. And under the Prime Minister's tax plans, households will be £870 worse off on average by 2028. These are the statistics that the Minister missed out when he spoke to us. And in contrast, in the party opposite, who've consistently failed to set out how they will pay for their £46 billion unfunded commitment to abolish national insurance, all of our plans in the Labour Party are fully costed. And let me be clear, a Labour government won't be celebrating finally meeting the inflation target for the first time in years. We won't be doing a tone-deaf victory lap. We wouldn't be doing for overseeing a decade and a half of stagnant growth. Instead, in our party, we've pledged to deliver economic stability with tough spending rules so that we can grow our economy and keep taxes, inflation and mortgages as low as possible. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, the choices at the next election are clear. 5 more years of chaos with the Conservatives or stability with a changed Labour Party. And that's why the government is running scared time and time after, choosing to bottle it rather than go to the country. And I hope today of all days the Prime Minister does the right thing. It's time for this exhausted and failing government to step aside in the national interest and for to call an election and let the responsible party take charge. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to start by welcoming the remarks from the Shadow Minister and to say, first of all, that there is nobody on this side of the House, and definitely not me, who somehow feels that times are not tough for many millions of people still. And we are acutely aware of that, and that's why we've worked so hard over the last few years to take the difficult decisions required to guide the country through the difficulties wrought by COVID, the biggest pandemic in 100 years, wrought by the energy shock from the war in the Ukraine. So nobody on this side minimises the difficulties that people have gone through and many still go through. I'd like to pick her up on a couple of points of fact, if I may, Madam Deputy Speaker. The first is when she quoted the IMF, and when she's asking about selective quotes, well, she wins the prize on that one, I'm afraid. Whereas the IMF were very, very clear. Over the next 5 and 6 years, the UK will be the fastest growing country in the G7 outside North America. The IMF was very clear about that. She mentioned confusion. I'm afraid, I think that the party opposite, and indeed her, they are the ones who are confused. They're confused around the question of taxes. On taxes, we have scored the Labour plans on taxes, and they amount to an extra £2,094 over 4 years for the average person. That's been scored. They mention that they want to grow the economy, and they say that they're pro-business. At least that's what they tell business people outside this House. They say they're pro-business. But then they're putting in place a workers' plan led by the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party that will impose 70 new regulations on small businesses, that will impose way more power for trade unions, that will impose day one rights on employment, that will ban flexible working, it will damage a lot of the things that make the small businesses in this country successful. And I will conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, simply by saying this. If you want a government that wants to cut inflation further, that wants to grow the economy, you do not increase borrowing and increase taxes like the party opposite.
Chair of the Treasury Select Committee, Dame Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I welcome the Minister's statement, which was crammed full of very useful facts and statistics. And yesterday the Select Committee was able to meet with the IMF, and the IMF met us in private, but we had a very interesting and informative discussion with them. But I think I would particularly cite from their report yesterday that they point out that none of this good economic news would be happening were it not for decisions that have happened in previous budgets. And they particularly point out, and I quote, "The government has delivered several helpful measures over the last 3 budgets. Investment tax reliefs for businesses to boost investment, an expansion of childcare and active labour market policies." This good news is not happening as an accident. It's happening because a plan is in place and the plan is working. And does the Minister agree with me? Yeah.
I thank my honourable friend, the Chair of the Select Committee, for that question. And I'll pick up on, and I do agree with her, but I'll pick up on one thing in particular, which I think often gets ignored. The Chancellor's decisions over the last 2 fiscal events have set this country up for growth in the future. And my honourable friend mentioned the policies on business expensing. That meant that's a £10 billion tax cut for business. She mentioned the policies on childcare. That helps millions of working families up and down this country. And the cumulative effect of a series of important measures is why we're able to stand up here today and say that not everything, we're not there yet, but the economy is starting to turn a corner.
SNP spokesperson David Lind.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And as others have done, I want to thank the Minister for advance sight of his statement. The Government, understandably, would like to paint these latest inflation figures as a win, but I think the House will forgive me if I don't join them in a victory lap, because the reality for many households across Scotland, many of whom are continuing to struggle, is that the cost of living crisis is far from over, and people are still feeling the pinch in their pockets. Food bank usage is skyrocketing, mortgage rates are soaring. For people in Scotland, this is the cost of living with Westminster. Now, the inflation of the past 3 years has seen prices rise by 19% when they should have risen by 6%. And of course, falling inflation does not mean that those prices will now fall. And with figures like this, it is little surprise, is it not, that polling this week showed that just 9% of people across the UK believe that the cost of living crisis is over. And only on Friday, I attended a food bank drive at Asda in Parkhead, where residents were literally donating in their droves to Glasgow North East Food Bank in recognition of the fact that many of their neighbours simply cannot afford to eat. So I've got one simple question for the Minister. Does he not realise that today's statement and all the fantushery that goes with it absolutely flies in the face of the reality for many people who are still struggling today in 21st century Britain?
My response to the honourable gentleman, who I respect deeply, is twofold. The first is that we are at an inflection point. The job is not complete. We know that many millions of people are suffering, and that's why we're continuing to improve their incomes through cutting their taxes. That's why we're continuing to make sure that small businesses around this country can thrive. That's why we're continuing to put more money into our public services and indeed reduce inflation. And so we know the job is not done. And the second point I would make to him is that it is a result of the difficult decisions that had to be taken over recent years because of the generationally unique shocks that we saw. That is the reason why many people have had to suffer. It's been up to this government to guide and help the country through that. And that's what we will continue to do in the weeks and months ahead.
Sir Liam Fox.
So, inflation is now lower than France or Germany or the Eurozone. Growth has been upgraded by the IMF. In trade, Britain's become the world's 4th biggest exporter, overtaking the Netherlands, France and Germany. Employment's at historically high levels. The UK is the 3rd biggest destination globally for inward investment. On financial services investment, we're top, attracting 108 projects last year compared to France's 39 or Germany's 38. I wonder if my honourable friend can correct me, or did I miss the post-Brexit apocalypse that many, including the Treasury, predicted?
My right honourable friend has put that incredibly well in relation to the very good things that have happened in this economy over recent months, in particular in my own area in financial services. And what I would add around the point about post-Brexit, there were many people concerned on all sides of the House about the impact on the British economy of Brexit. I think what my right honourable friend has suggested, the record of this government, it's shown that this government has been able to guide the country through that post-Brexit period to better times than ever.
Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, sometimes this House really is a theatre. The ministers come to dispatch box, really all jubilant. There are my constituents queue outside food banks for hours, from 9 o'clock in the morning until 9 o'clock at night. Prices are more expensive than when the Tories first took office. 14 years this government has had, and you have destroyed the economy. People pay mortgages £250 more a month, according to the Bank of England. I cannot believe that the minister is saying that things are going to get better. Ultimately, Madam Deputy Speaker, I hope in a few hours' time that when the Prime Minister is outside number 10, that he calls for a general election, people can make a choice and vote Labour.
My response to that, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that this Parliament has seen an unprecedented hit to people's living standards because of COVID. A once-in-100-year impact. Might I remind the House, this government spent £450 billion supporting the economy, supporting people through programmes like furlough, supporting small businesses through discretionary grants, supporting the NHS. There are so many things that were opposed by the party opposite. They mentioned borrowing, they mentioned taxes. If it was up to them, we'd have been in lockdown for longer. Right? If it was up to them, we'd have borrowed more. If it was up to them, they wouldn't have made the decisions we had to. Tough decisions on public sector pay that meant that working with the partnership of the Bank of England, we could bring inflation down. We are at an inflection point. Not everything is complete. We are not there yet. But the economy is starting to turn a corner through the leadership of this government.
Sir Robert Sims.
We've had a number of statistics on the economy over recent months which have been unalloyed good news for this country. And it is good news that the economy is doing better, that inflation is down, that growth is up, that trade is up. And that makes us all richer, that makes gives more jobs for people in employment. And I think that should be rejoiced by everybody in this House, including people on the other side who might actually end up in government and inherit the benefit of some of the things that this government is doing. In truth, I'm always a little surprised by when good news comes along, how miserable the opposition gets.
I think that the important point about what my right honourable friend has said about the party opposite is that I do disagree with him on one key measure, I must admit, which is the idea that they might inherit this, because, of course, we are not complete yet, Madam Deputy Speaker. We know that the economy still needs to continue to turn. We know that inflation needs to come down. We hope that that will lead in due course to falling interest rates as well, and for the measures that we put in place to come to fruition over the next Parliament.
Patricia Gibson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the UK economy is smaller now and living standards are lower now than at the start of this Parliament. The first time this has ever happened. Does the Minister agree that it's a sign of increasing Tory desperation, that they consider it a cause for celebration, that the UK economy has stopped shrinking, with growth still lower than in Europe, than in Asia, than the Americas, than Australia, and we continue to pay the price of Brexit and Tory incompetence?
I'm afraid, Madam Deputy Speaker, I disagree on points of fact with what the Honourable Lady has said. The economy, I've already set out so many statistics about why things are significantly improving in the economy and are improving at a faster rate than most of our competitors in Europe, and I completely disagree on her assessment.
Richard Fuller.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister was right to come to update the House on the positive progress with inflation today. Right to make the point that people are continuing to find economic difficulties at the time and that we need to stick with the Prime Minister's plan. Right to point out the terrible risks to the economy that the Labour Party's policies on labour markets and on taxes will do. And right to say that there have been external factors, and that is different when you tackle external factors that are one-offs from what your policies are looking forward. But if I can ask him one specific point that has been raised often about the external factors. In this period of government, we've also ended the period of quantitative easing, printing money, and moved the process of quantitative tightening, paying back money. The IMF in their reports say that by 2025, the balance sheet for the Bank of England should be settled. Will he look at the longer range forecasts that the OBR put out and see what flexibility that provides for the government for cutting taxes or increasing expenditure?
I thank my honourable friend for a characteristically thoughtful and informed question. I will indeed look at what he said about the Bank of England's accounts balanced by 2025, and I will look at that and talk to him about that in due course.
Chio Mora.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister, like the Chancellor, likes to talk about the difficult decisions that Conservative administrations have made. The cost of the family shop has risen by £1,000 since the last election. The difficult decisions are the ones families in Newcastle have to make every time they go to a supermarket. Yeah. Isn't it the case? There's the decisions that his party have made, austerity, stealth taxes for working people, crushing growth out of the economy and then crashing it all together. It's those choices which are why my constituents are worse off.
I'm afraid I disagree with the Honourable Lady in this respect. It is very, very important that this House recognises and admits that when there is a once-in-a-generation pandemic that cost the government over £400 billion supporting people, it was necessary for a period of time for the tax burden to rise in order to help pay for that. That was a difficult and responsible decision. But then, when you move into a point of relative calm, it is then a choice between one side of the House and the other side of the House about how we want the economy and the fiscal position to be over the medium term permanently. And this side of the House, we choose high business investment, high growth, lower taxes for working people, and they choose more union power, higher borrowing, higher taxes. And I think the British public is going to stick with us.
French.
Deputy Speaker, the latest UK economic data is welcome news, with inflation falling again, real wages rising, and the UK is forecast to grow faster than many peers. The IMF are now recommending that the Bank of England cuts interest rates. I agree. But what does the Minister think of the IMF's views?
As my honourable friend knows, it is for the monetary policy of the Bank of England to determine the policy on interest rates, but indeed working in partnership with the Bank of England to cut inflation means that will be, we hope, that means that at some point later in the year, interest rates, as the IMF have suggested, will start to come down as a result of inflation being at target.
Florence Ashlomi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Even in response to the Minister's last reply there, even if interest rates are cut later this year, for a number of constituents, in my constituency of Vauxhall, that will not make an impact. People have seen their mortgage and rent go up, as my honourable friend said, by over £240 a month, according to the Bank of England. Over 10.1 million people are falling behind on their bills, according to research by Stop the Squeeze. The Resolution Foundation has found that annual bills in 2024 are now 67% higher in real terms than in 2021. This isn't a time to celebrate. I know that at my advice surgery, in a week's time, my constituents are going to come to me raising these issues. The fact that they cannot afford to heat their home, they cannot afford to keep up with their bills. Will the Minister accept that, yes, these statistics may look good, but for real people, this is another slap in the face?
What I will certainly accept is that there are millions of people in this country for whom the cost of living crisis is still real. That is why we're taking the action that we are taking. That is why working people are now £900, your person on an average salary is £900 better off than they would have been a year ago as a result of cutting national insurance. That is why we're focusing hard on making sure we bring down borrowing rather than increase borrowing as planned by the party opposite. And what I would say to her constituents, if I were to speak to them at her surgery, is I would say that the economy is on the right track. We are on the point, and the economy is starting to turn the corner. If we go with the party opposite's leadership, things are going to get a lot worse. And that is why we need to keep on the plan that we have set out.
Neil Hudson, Dr. Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for the encouraging economic update? It is so disappointing when we get good news on the economy, it is talked down by the opposition. With inflation down to 2.3%, it really shows that the economic plan is working from this government. With national insurance reductions, pensions increases, boosting jobs and a growing economy, does my honourable friend agree with me that it's only the Conservatives that can be trusted to manage the economy soundly?
I would agree with my honourable friend, and he's a fantastic champion for his constituents in this House, as everybody in this House knows. And the only thing I would add from what he has said is that this side of the House knows what it is to take responsible decisions and take them for the long term.
James Sunderland.
Madam Deputy Speaker, given the global macro shocks faced during this Parliament, particularly the pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it is quite remarkable, in my view, that we've got inflation back down to 2.3%. And it's testimony, in my view, to good fiscal policy, and we are leading the way within the G7. Does the Minister agree with me that for those constituents living in Bracknell Forest wanting low inflation, higher employment, higher wages and higher growth, that sticking to the plan is absolutely the right thing to do?
My honourable friend is a brilliant champion for Bracknell Forest, a part of the country that I know very well, and I completely agree with his remarks.
Jack Brereton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This positive economic news is extremely welcome, and I've also welcomed the action taken by the government to reduce the amount of tax on working families. Given this very positive economic outlook now, will my honourable friend speak to the Chancellor about looking at the personal tax allowance and increasing that, particularly to help those working families, but also to take more of those pensioners out of paying tax?
As my honourable friend, the member for Stoke, knows, the Chancellor keeps all taxes under review, and I will ensure that he has heard the comments and pleas from my honourable friend.
Cho.
Madam Deputy Speaker, does my honourable friend accept that today's good news would be even better if the government had implemented the public sector exit payments restrictions which were legislated for in 2016 and were the subject of a consultation which ended 17 months ago and in respect of which apparently the government is unable to agree a response? Surely the government should be able to do something about this and save the £2 billion which it so far cost. And isn't this an example of it being sabotaged by the civil service?
I thank my honourable friend, and indeed I've been in correspondence with him a few months ago on this very question, and I'm happy to engage with him on this again.
I thank the Minister for his statement.